Chapter 1. It was the kind of summer afternoon that St. Mildred's prided itself on. Golden sunlight casting gentle patterns through the ancient oaks, the scent of freshly clipped roses lingering in the air, and the faint murmur of polite conversation as villagers gathered for the annual garden fete at Rosewood Manor. Lady Eleanor Withers, ever the gracious hostess, stood by the pavilion in a pale lavender dress, accepting compliments with a gracious nod. The fete was her pride, a tradition passed down through generations. Beneath the shade of the grand oak, local ladies arranged trays of cucumber sandwiches and scones, while the vicar's wife oversaw the raffle for the church roof restoration. Off roof, the attendees, Miss Jane Marple, sat demurely at a table adorned with a lace tablecloth, her gloved hands gently cradling a cup of tea. She listened to the pleasant hum of village gossip with the quiet interest of one who had long understood the delicate art of listening. People assumed her mind was filled with knitting patterns and parish notices, but Miss Marple was observing, always observing. It was precisely at the moment when the choir began a rendition of Greensleeves that the commotion began. A scream shattered the peaceful gathering. It was sharp, piercing, a sound not of surprise, but of horror. Heads turned as Mrs. Eliza Harcourt, a stout woman in an unfortunate shade of mustard, staggered back from the rose trellis at the far end of the garden. "Oh, dear heavens! Lady Eleanor! Someone fetch help!" Miss Marple rose swiftly, her eyes narrowing as she followed the line of the woman's trembling hand. There, slumped against the trellis, was the lifeless body of a man, his cravat askew, his silver hair dishevelled. A single withered rose lay on his lapel. Sir Reginald Withers, Lady Eleanor's husband. The fate was over. The mystery had begun. Chapter 2. The garden fete dissolved into chaos. Women gasped and clutched their pearls. Men rushed forward in an attempt to take control of the scene, and the younger crowd, initially eager for excitement, soon recoiled at the grim reality before them. Miss Marple, however, remained composed. She had seen death before, unexpected, untimely, and more often than not, unnatural. Her keen blue eyes swept over the lifeless form of Sir Reginald Withers, noting the peculiar details others overlooked in their shock. Lady Eleanor, pale as the lace on her gloves, stood frozen, her lips slightly parted. "Reginald?" she whispered, as if still hoping he might stir. It was the vicar, Reverend Ambrose, who finally stepped forward, removing his hat with solemnity. "We must send for Dr. Hargreaves at once." Yes, of course," stammered Mr. Beechcroft, the town solicitor, fumbling for his pocket-watch as though it might offer some legal guidance in the matter. Dr. Hargreaves, a stout man in his 60s, arrived within minutes, having been seated near the refreshment table. He bent over the body, checking for any sign of life. The murmuring crowd hushed as he pressed his fingers to Sir Reginald's throat, then straightened with a sigh. "I'm afraid he's quite dead." A collective murmur rippled through the villagers. But how?" asked Mrs. Harcourt, wringing her hands. "He was fine just an hour ago." Dr. Hargreaves frowned, adjusting his spectacles. "Difficult to say just yet. There are no immediate signs of injury. We must wait for the proper authorities." Miss Marple glanced down at the withered rose still clinging to Sir Reginald's lapel. A curious thing, its petals browned at the high edges, fragile as dust. Why a single rose, plucked yet wilted? It was such a small detail, but Miss Marple knew from experience that small details were often the most telling. The murmurs of the villagers grew louder as Inspector Leonard Graves arrived, his sharp eyes scanning the assembled crowd before settling on the body. He was a man of good repute, though somewhat dismissive of amateurs, especially elderly women who, in his view, had no business concerning themselves with police matters. "Right, I'll need statements," he announced, pulling out his notepad. "No one leaves until we've had a proper account of what happened." Miss Marple smiled politely, stepping back into the crowd, blending in as she always did. People often mistook her for an inconsequential old woman, and she found it quite useful. She already had a feeling about this case, and she suspected that Sir Reginald's death was far from natural. Chapter 3. The villagers of St. Mildred's were no strangers to gossip, and by the time Inspector Graves had finished his initial statements, the garden fete had transformed into a battleground of whispered speculations. Theories flew from one end of Rosewood Manor to the other. Poisoning, a sudden heart attack, an old scandal finally catching up with Sir Reginald. Miss Marple, however, had learned long ago that the most popular theories were rarely the correct ones. She stood quietly near the refreshment table, listening intently as the inspector questioned Lady Eleanor. The widow's face was unreadable. Pale, yes, but not hysterical. If she had been crying, she had done so in silence. "When did you last see your husband alive, Lady Eleanor?" Graves asked, his voice firm but not unkind. Lady Eleanor inhaled shakily. "Just before the fete began. He mentioned wanting a moment to himself before mingling with the guests. I didn't think anything of it. He often took short walks around the grounds." Graves jotted this down. "And did he seem unwell?" A pause, then a slow shake of her head. "No, perhaps a little tired, but nothing out of the ordinary." Miss Marple watched Lady Eleanor closely. There was something in her manner, an absence of surprise, perhaps, or was it simply the shock of grief? Graves turned to Dr. Hargreaves. "You mentioned there were no signs of injury. Could it have been a heart attack?" The doctor pursed his lips. "Possible, but there's something odd about it." That caught Miss Marple's attention. "Odd?" she echoed gently, stepping forward. Graves sighed. "Miss Marple, this is a police matter." "Oh, of course, Inspector," she said pleasantly. "I wouldn't dream of interfering. But dear Dr. Hargreaves does seem to have noticed something worth discussing, don't you think?" Dr. Hargreaves gave a small cough, clearly hesitant under the weight of official scrutiny. "It's simply that his expression, well, it's rather unusual. I've seen men pass from natural causes before, and typically there's a certain slackness in the face. But Sir Reginald's features appear somewhat contorted, as if he were in distress before he died." Lady Eleanor stiffened. "You mean he suffered?" Hargreaves hesitated. "I can't say for certain, but something about it strikes me as—" He glanced at Miss Marple. "Unnatural?" The inspector frowned. "So, you're suggesting this might not have been a natural death?" "I'm suggesting," Hargreaves corrected, "that we should wait for a proper post-mortem before making any assumptions." The tension in the air was palpable. Sir Reginald Withers, the respected yet somewhat reclusive baronet, was dead, and while no one dared say it outright just yet, a darker question was already taking root in the villagers' minds. Had he been murdered? Miss Marple glanced once more at the single withered rose on his lapel. She didn't believe in coincidences, not where death was concerned, and she had a feeling that this was only the beginning. Chapter 4. The fete had ended in silence. The villagers of St. Mildred's, usually so eager to linger over the last of the tea and cakes, had departed in hushed groups, their cheerful chatter replaced by murmurs of speculation. Inside Rosewood Manor, Lady Eleanor sat in the drawing-room, her hands folded tightly in her lap. The air smelled faintly of roses, though the vase on the mantelpiece had begun to droop, its petals curling inward. Miss Marple, seated across from her, observed the widow with quiet attentiveness. Inspector Graves stood near the fireplace, flipping through his notes. "You mentioned Sir Reginald had no known health issues, Lady Eleanor. But was he under any particular strain? Business troubles? Personal concerns?" A pause. Then a slight shake of the head. "Not that I was aware of." "And your relationship?" Lady Eleanor lifted her chin, her expression unreadable. "We were married for 30 years, Inspector." "That doesn't answer my question." Miss Marple watched as Lady Eleanor's fingers twitched slightly against her dress, but her voice remained calm. "Reginald and I had different temperaments. He was a private man, not one for open affections. But we understood each other." The inspector tapped his pencil against the notepad. "You didn't appear particularly shocked when you saw his body." Lady Eleanor's lips pressed into a thin line. "Perhaps I am simply better at containing my emotions than others." Graves studied her, then shifted his attention. "Miss Marple, you always seem to find yourself in the middle of things like this." Miss Marple smiled mildly. "Oh, purely by coincidence, I assure you." The inspector gave a dubious grunt. "And what do you make of this so far?" Miss Marple took a small sip of her tea before answering. "I think it is always wise, Inspector, to ask why a man was in the place where he died. People do not often collapse in the middle of rose trellises without reason." Graves frowned. "Are you suggesting he was lured there?" Miss Marple set her cup down gently. "Merely that it's an odd place to be found. And then, of course, there's the withered rose." The inspector gave an exasperated sigh. "I fail to see why a flower is important when we don't even know if this was a crime." "Oh, I'm sure you're quite right," Miss Marple said amiably. "But then, I do recall something rather interesting. Sir Reginald was known to be very particular about his appearance. Was he not, Lady Eleanor?" Lady Eleanor gave a slow nod. "Yes, he always took care with his dress." Miss Marple leaned forward slightly. "Then why, I wonder, would he wear a dying rose?" A silence settled over the room. The inspector's expression darkened. Miss Marple smoothed her skirt, her eyes twinkling with something almost like satisfaction. "Such a small thing. But small things, I find, often have a way of being quite significant." Lady Eleanor exhaled softly, her fingers tightening in her lap. For the first time, there was a faint tremor in her composure, and Miss Marple saw it. Chapter 5. The night had settled heavily over St. Mildred's, a thick fog creeping in from the moors, curling around the chimneys of the village like ghostly fingers. At Rosewood Manor, the drawing-room remained dimly lit, a single lamp casting long shadows across the Persian rug. The air was thick with unspoken tension. Inspector Graves had left, promising a full post-mortem report by morning, but Miss Marple knew better than to wait idly for official answers. She believed the truth often lay in the mundane details, the things overlooked by those too eager to solve a mystery with haste. Lady Eleanor had retired for the evening, though Miss Marple suspected she would find little rest. That left Miss Marple in the company of the housekeeper, Mrs. Weatherby, an old fixture of Rosewood Manor, whose years of service had made her an expert in the private affairs of the Withers household. "I can't say I was surprised, Miss Marple," Mrs. Weatherby said, her voice hushed as she poured tea into 2 delicate china cups. "Sir Reginald wasn't a well-liked man. No one would say so openly, of course, but in private, oh, there were plenty who had grievances." Miss Marple took a sip, her eyes twinkling. "Really now? And why was that?" Mrs. Weatherby leaned in slightly, lowering her voice as though the walls might be listening. "He wasn't cruel, not in the way that leaves bruises, but he had a way of making people feel small, dismissed. He could be sharp-tongued, and if he didn't approve of someone, well, he made sure they knew it." "Curious," Miss Marple murmured. "And was there anyone in particular who might have taken great offence?" Mrs. Weatherby hesitated before setting her cup down with a soft clink. "There's young Arthur Longford, the groundskeeper's son. He's a good lad, but he and Sir Reginald had a row some weeks back. Something about money, I believe." Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully. "And Lady Eleanor, the housekeeper's expression tightened. She suffered in silence, she did. A lady of her standing, divorce was out of the question. But I dare say she was unhappy. Sir Reginald had a way of making her feel more like a possession than a wife." Miss Marple sighed softly. It was always the same in these small villages. Secrets buried beneath well-manicured lawns, whispered resentments tucked away like old letters in forgotten drawers. A gust of wind rattled the window panes, and for a brief moment the candle on the side table flickered. Mrs. Weatherby shivered. "I don't like to say it, Miss Marple, but mark my words. Sir Reginald's death wasn't natural. I can feel it." Miss Marple gave her a small, knowing smile. "Yes, my dear, I do believe you may be right." And she suspected that the withered rose on Sir Reginald's lapel was the first whisper of a much deeper truth. Chapter 6. Morning arrived in St. Mildred's with an eerie stillness. The usual hum of village life, the milkman's cart rattling down the lane, the distant toll of the church bell, felt muted, as if the very air held its breath in anticipation. At Rosewood Manor, the drawing-room was once again occupied, this time by Inspector Graves, who had returned with a grim expression and a folded piece of paper in his hand. Miss Marple sat across from him, her knitting needles resting idly in her lap. Lady Eleanor, looking even paler than the day before, stood by the window, staring out at the gardens where her husband had been found. "Well," Graves began, setting the paper on the table with a deliberate motion, "we have the preliminary post-mortem results." Lady Eleanor turned, her voice barely above a whisper. "And?" Graves exhaled. "It wasn't natural causes." A hush fell over the room. Miss Marple waited, her hands perfectly still, There were traces of a rare plant-based poison in his system, Graves continued. The coroner believes it was administered shortly before his death, perhaps within an hour or two. Lady Eleanor sank into a chair. Poison? Graves gave a tight nod. Yes, and not an easy one to come by. It's derived from a particular variety of foxglove, Digitalis purpurea. A skilled hand would have to extract and prepare it. Miss Marple's expression remained unreadable. A skilled hand indeed, she murmured. Graves leaned forward. Which brings us to a very important question. How was it administered? There was no sign of a struggle, and Sir Reginald wasn't the type to take an unfamiliar drink from just anyone. Miss Marple's eyes drifted toward the mantelpiece, where the vase of roses stood, their petals now fully wilted. The rose, she said softly. Graves frowned. The rose? Miss Marple nodded. It struck me as odd from the beginning. Sir Reginald was always particular about his appearance. A withered rose is not something he would have chosen for his lapel. Lady Eleanor's voice wavered. But what does that mean? Miss Marple gave a small, knowing smile. It means, dear Lady Eleanor, that someone wanted him to wear it. And if I were to hazard a guess, I would say that the poison was on the petals. A heavy silence followed her words. Graves sat back, considering. A contact poison, he muttered, absorbed through the skin, slow-acting enough that he wouldn't have noticed at first. Miss Marple gave a gentle nod. Precisely. A clever method, don't you think? No glass to trace, no forced ingestion, just a simple, familiar gesture. A man plucks a flower, perhaps offered by someone he trusts, and places it on his lapel. A perfectly innocent action. Graves narrowed his eyes, which means whoever did this knew him well enough to anticipate that habit. Lady Eleanor shuddered. But who? Graves snapped his notebook shut. That's what we need to find out. Miss Marple, however, already had a few suspicions. For a murder committed with such elegance, the culprit was unlikely to be an amateur. No, this was the work of someone with patience, knowledge, someone who understood both human nature and the deadly potential of a single withered rose, and she intended to find them. Chapter 7. Inspector Graves left Rosewood Manor with a renewed sense of urgency, promising to send his men to investigate who in the village might have access to such a rare poison. But Miss Marple knew better than to rely solely on official inquiries. The truth was often found in whispered conversations and half-forgotten details, things the police, in their need for concrete evidence, tended to overlook. That was why, rather than returning home, she took a detour through the village, making her way to a small cottage at the edge of St. Mildred's. The cottage belonged to Arthur Longford, the groundskeeper's son, a young man with calloused hands, a strong temper, and, if Mrs. Weatherby's gossip was to be believed, a reason. To hold a grudge against Sir Reginald, Miss Marple knocked lightly on the wooden door. A few moments later, it swung open to reveal Arthur himself, a tall, broad-shouldered man with a wary expression. "Miss Marple," he said, surprised. "What brings you here?" Miss Marple smiled kindly. "Oh, just an old woman's curiosity, my dear. You see, I find myself quite troubled over the unfortunate death of Sir Reginald." Arthur's face darkened. A tragedy, that. "Indeed," Miss Marple agreed. "And yet I can't help but wonder, when was the last time you saw him?" Arthur hesitated, then sighed. "Few days ago. He called me up to the manor. made a fuss about the way I'd trimmed the hedges near the east wall. Said it wasn't precise enough for his tastes. Miss Marple's expression remained gentle. I heard the two of you had some disagreement over money. Arthur's jaw tightened. That wasn't my doing. My father worked that land for 30 years. When he took ill, I took over. But Sir Reginald, he wasn't one for kindness. Cut my father's wages when he could no longer work. Said he wouldn't pay a man who wasn't doing his job. Miss Marple tisked softly. That must have been difficult for your family. Arthur exhaled sharply. I'll tell you this, Miss Marple. Sir Reginald had plenty of enemies. People won't say it now, out of respect for the dead, but he wasn't loved. Not by his staff, not by his wife, not by half the people in this village. Miss Marple's sharp ears caught the slight emphasis on his wife. How very interesting, she murmured. And tell me, Arthur, have you ever had an interest in botany? Arthur blinked. Plants? No, not really. Why? Oh, no reason, Miss Marple said lightly. Only I do find it fascinating how certain plants can be quite useful. Some even deadly if one knows how to prepare them. Arthur frowned, but before he could respond, a voice called from inside the cottage. Arthur? Who is it? Miss Marple turned just in time to see Vera Simons, the young assistant to the village apothecary, step into view. A striking woman with auburn hair and keen green eyes. Vera had a sharp wit and a reputation for knowing more than she let on. Miss Marple smiled. Ah, Miss Simons, what a pleasant surprise. Vera's gaze was cautious. Miss Marple. You work for Mr. Pritchard, don't you? The apothecary? Vera nodded slowly. I do. Miss Marple's smile remained pleasant, but her mind was already racing. Arthur might have had a motive, but Vera had the means. And something about the way she avoided Miss Marple's gaze told her that the young woman had secrets of her own. Chapter 8. Miss Marple, ever polite, did not linger too long at Arthur Longford's cottage, though she had seen and heard enough to pique her interest. Vera Simons had been quick to excuse herself, disappearing into the back room as though avoiding further conversation. A curious thing indeed. As she walked back through the village, Miss Marple considered what she knew. Arthur had resentment, rightly so, given how Sir Reginald had treated his father. But Vera worked in the apothecary, where one could obtain all sorts of substances, including the very poison that had been found in Sir Reginald's body. And yet, was revenge truly the motive here, or was there something else at play? The sound of hurried footsteps pulled Miss Marple from her thoughts. She turned to see Mrs. Weatherby, the Wither's long-time housekeeper, waving at her with an anxious expression. Miss Marple. Oh, thank goodness I found you, Miss Marple smiled gently. My dear Mrs. Weatherby, you look quite flustered. Whatever is the matter? The housekeeper lowered her voice, casting a quick glance around to make sure they weren't overheard. It's about Lady Eleanor. She's been behaving oddly. Miss Marple raised an eyebrow. Oh? Mrs. Weatherby wrung her hands. Ever since the inspector left this morning, she's been pacing, muttering to herself. And just now, I swear it, Miss Marple, I saw her slip something into the fireplace. Miss Marple's expression remained calm, but her mind sharpened with interest. Something? Mrs. Weatherby nodded fervently. A letter, I think. A piece of paper. She burned it before I could get a good look. Miss Marple pursed her lips. That is rather interesting. Miss Marple. The housekeeper hesitated, then took a deep breath. I've worked for Lady Eleanor for years. She's always been a good woman, and that meant the real killer was someone far more calculating. Someone who didn't want revenge. Someone who wanted Sir Reginald gone. For good. Chapter 10. The truth, Miss Marple had always believed, was like a dropped stitch in knitting. Small, easily missed, but when tugged upon, it could unravel everything. And now, standing in the grand hall of Rosewood Manor, she felt that final thread coming loose. Inspector Graves had returned, his patience wearing thin as he confronted Lady Eleanor in the drawing-room. You destroyed a letter that could have been crucial evidence, he said sternly. That doesn't look very good, Lady Eleanor. Lady Eleanor's face was pale but composed. I told you I was trying to protect Vera. And yet, Miss Marple interjected gently, I wonder if that was your only reason. Graves turned to her. Miss Marple, if you have something to say, now is the time. Miss Marple smiled serenely. I believe I do, Inspector. She turned to Lady Eleanor. The poison was administered through the withered rose. A subtle, elegant method, one that required patience and care. She paused. It was not an act of rage. It was an act of planning. A hush fell over the room. Miss Marple continued. Arthur Longford had a motive. Vera Simons had the means. But neither of them fit the nature of this crime. She turned fully to Lady Eleanor. You, my dear, had both. Gasps filled the room. Lady Eleanor stiffened. That's absurd. Miss Marple shook her head. Not at all. You were trapped in a loveless marriage, bound by duty and reputation. Sir Reginald was cruel in ways that did not leave bruises, but you felt them all the same. And then he confessed his crime. A crime that, if exposed, would bring scandal, ruin the family name. Miss Marple's voice softened. You saw a way out, didn't you? A way to free yourself without consequence. Poison, delivered in the most poetic of ways, through the very thing your husband loved. A rose. Lady Eleanor's breath was shallow, but she remained silent. Graves stepped forward. Is this true? Lady Eleanor's lips trembled. You have no proof. Miss Marple sighed. Perhaps not in the way you mean, but the truth has a way of revealing itself. She gestured towards the mantelpiece. Tell me, Inspector, when you searched the room, did you happen to notice that the vase of roses was missing? Graves frowned. Now that you mention it, Miss Marple nodded. I suspect Lady Eleanor removed it this morning. You see, if tested, the petals of those roses would likely reveal traces of the very poison that killed her husband. Lady Eleanor's composure finally cracked. Her breath hitched, her hands shaking as she clasped them together. I didn't want to hurt anyone, she whispered. I only wanted to be free. Graves signalled his men. Lady Eleanor Withers, I'm afraid I'll have to ask you to come with us. She stood, her head held high, as if resigning herself to fate. As she passed Miss Marple, she hesitated for just a moment. You always knew, didn't you? Miss Marple gave her a gentle smile. I suspected." Lady Eleanor nodded once, then allowed herself to be led away. The room fell silent. Mrs. Weatherby wiped her eyes. Poor woman! Miss Marple sighed. Murder is never truly justified, my dear. But I do believe, in the end, she thought it was the only way. She picked up her knitting. The case was solved, but St. Mildred's would not forget the day a single withered rose brought death to Rosewood Manor. The end.